Welcome again to the Southern Christian Coalition's weekly lectionary show. This is a weekly show where we discuss the news of the day and the Revised Common Lectionary text for the upcoming Sunday. I'm your host, Joe Sheeran, organizer with the Southern Christian Coalition. We have a great guest panel on this Wednesday, the 13th, which is day 60 of coronavirus here in Tennessee. We've got the Reverend Matt Steinhauer, pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Lebanon, Tennessee. The Reverend Nick Baird-Chrisohon, pastor of Charlotte-Fagan UMC in Charlotte, Tennessee. And we've got Lauren Tillman, area coordinator with the Office of Housing and Residential Experience at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. Welcome all of you to the show. Thanks for joining us. It's a busy week, as they all are, so I'll try to make this rundown fast. There's reports that the hospitalizations for COVID-19 so far have been less in Tennessee than originally predicted, according to a report released by Vanderbilt University's faculty. We've seen less than 300 hospitalizations statewide instead of the 1,200 that we were expecting by mid-May. So that's good news. But the report cautions that it is too early to assess the impact of businesses reopening across the state or of more Tennesseans resuming activities outside their homes. Meanwhile, according to the Tennessee state government count, the rate of new cases per day is already starting to creep back up for the last couple of days, with 559 and 567 new cases for each of the last 2 days after 9 days of a lower case rate. Here we have data visualization. I'm going to share my screen just for a second here. We've got data visualization from 91 DVOC. I don't know if you all can see that, okay? And this is using data collected from Johns Hopkins University. It shows new cases today on a 7-day average. So it's a little bit more rounded. If we were to flip it to new cases per day, it's a little bit more chaotic. But we can see with that 1 week average that we are seeing a definite creep back up for the last couple of days. And then in Governor Lee's media briefing yesterday, we had Dr. Lisa Piercy, who is one of the Tennessee Health Commissioners. She had some interesting fun facts to share about how prison infections are affecting the rate for Tennessee. I'm gonna see if we can get her to come up on the clip here. That's good enough.
Thank you, sir.
Can you all hear?
Good afternoon. Case count today is 16,111. While overall that's a 3.6% increase from yesterday, I do want to make note that both today's numbers and yesterday's numbers both included about half of the total were inmates. It was, I think, 270 yesterday and 267 today. And when you remove those contained populations, the community growth rate day over day is 1.9%.
So that's, just in case anyone couldn't hear, that's 3.6% growth rate over the last 2 days. But if you take out prisoners, which make up half of that, it's just 1.9, which is good because prisoners don't count as people, right? She goes on to say that they have finished testing Tennessee's prison population, which is good because once you're tested, you don't ever need to be tested again. So according to the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit journalism site committed to reporting on the justice system, Tennessee prison system is the single most infected as a share of population in the system, and it's the 4th most total cases of any system, including the federal prison system. And according to the New York Times, Trousdale County, which is home to the Corsetic Prison Turner Correctional Facility, is the single most infected county in the United States, with twice the rate of infection per 100,000 people as the next most infected county. Bledsoe County, which is home to Tennessee Department of Corrections, Bledsoe County Correctional Complex is number 5. Meanwhile, the rest of Tennessee is well underway to reopening, with retail, restaurants, and even barber shops, nail salons, and gyms reopening across the state. Here in Nashville, we've seen restaurants and bars opening at half capacity, including on Broadway. And in Memphis, they are now 9 days into phase one of their reopening, with restaurants, retail, and gyms authorized to open at partial capacity. Yesterday, Dr. Fauci used much of his time before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions to urge states not to reopen until they know that they have capabilities to handle the inevitable uptick in cases once they relax stay-at-home orders. I quote, "My concern is that in some areas, states, cities, or what have you, jump over those various checkpoints and prematurely open up without having the capability of being able to respond effectively and efficiently. My concern is that we will start to see little spikes that might turn into outbreaks." He went on to say, "There is a real risk that you will trigger an outbreak that you may not be able to control, which paradoxically will not only set you back, but not only lead to suffering and death that could be avoided, but could even set you back on the road to that much valued economic recovery." This is important here in Tennessee because workers who choose not to go back to work because they feel unsafe, because they believe Dr. Fauci, will lose eligibility for unemployment benefits that they've been keeping, that hundreds of thousands of Tennesseans have been relying on to stay afloat. There's even a link on the Tennessee government's website for employers to report employees that refuse to report back to work when those businesses reopen, so that those employees will be definitively cut off. Law enforcement agencies across the state have entered into memorandums of understanding with the Tennessee Department of Health to receive daily updates on personal information of those with COVID-19 diagnoses. And here in Nashville, Metro Nashville's health department has been sharing that data more directly with MNPD. And finally, as the Ahmaud Arbery story continues to grow, Greg and Travis McMichael, the two Brunswick, Georgia men that shot and killed him back in February while he was jogging, have finally been arrested. Meanwhile, in Louisville, Kentucky, a case back in March where police entered the home of Breonna Taylor, age 26, without announcing or identifying themselves as police. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, who was a licensed gun owner, opened fire believing that someone was breaking in, and he was correct, it was the police. He shot and wounded an officer. Taylor, though, was shot and killed by police in the shootout, and Walker is currently being charged with assault and murder. Taylor's family is seeking a wrongful death suit, and they are in fact being represented by the same attorney who represented the family of Trayvon Martin and is now representing the Arbery family in the Georgia case. So with all of that heaviness, let's jump into the daily lectionary for this week. We are in Easter 6. We've got Acts 17, verse 22 to 31, Psalm 66, 8 through 20, 1 Peter 3, 13 through 22. And I think, Nick, you and Matt are both preaching on the John this week, which is John 14, 15 through 21. So let's open it up for discussion. If anyone has a response or wants to share what's going on in their community, this would be a good time to do that.
Where does one start?
Right.
You're right, Joe. This is an incredibly heavy slate of topics, and this doesn't even begin to discuss everything that's in the news. What is difficult sometimes, I think, especially I'm in a rural community, just an hour west of Nashville, and Dixon County so far has not been hit as strongly by COVID as some other places in Tennessee, which is true of a lot of the rural settings. But then we also note that hot spots, of course, in correctional facilities, that's a huge issue. Man, we could spend hours on that alone. But when I look at this John passage, I realize that God is speaking through Christ this, if you will love me, if you will keep my commandments, which in the chapter before this, John 13, Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, love one another. It's so succinct. And yet in this rural community that I live in, they know well the gospel message. They know the commandment. They know what love is cerebrally, and they know what love is for their family in very deep-rooted ways and their community in deep-rooted ways. But then you see a dissonance between what all's going on, because good Southern folks don't ever want to name anything directly. And in response to that, what all's going on and how do I respond to what all's going on? That's where we're seeing these breaks, right? People who are protesting, revolting, harming employees of Target and Walmart. God bless folks in retail if that's not hard enough. And it just breaks my heart that Christ's commandments that he says to keep prior to announcing the Holy Spirit's coming is love one another. Just be good to one another. And I struggle with people who profess Christianity are some of the same ones who say, I love God and by my faith, I'll be okay. And yet also silently or out loud condone these behaviors that are against love one another, keep my commandments. And if you struggle with it, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later in the Peter passage, if you struggle with it, that's what the Holy Spirit's for. But just love one another. You will be okay. And yet folks act as if it's the end of the world to do some of the basic bits of human decency to protect themselves and each other. And that's heartbreaking.
In my context, I serve a congregation. We have probably 60, 65 people average worship on Sunday. And I really sense, and I'm in a county where it's the second wealthiest county in Tennessee, and many times your congregation is going to mirror the population of your county. And so, being a pastor and preacher in a context where you've got a pretty good mirror of the predominant culture that's sitting in your pews or your chairs every Sunday morning, and the challenge of being called to serve the gospel, first and foremost. And you listen to this text, and one of my go-to commentaries, I really like the Eugene Boyne and Fred Craddock, People's New Testament Commentary. It's a very accessible commentary for not just preachers but lay people too. If you ever have anybody say what's a good source that I could look at, I would encourage you to point them to that book. And they talk about in this passage, if you they don't say this. I did the little, you can do the search in your Bible app, and in the 7 verses there are 14 yous, and they comment that this is the plural use of you, like us Southerners who use the word y'all. In fact, I encourage you to do this. It's kind of fun. I took the change feature in Word and changed the yous to y'all. And when you see that, it's just stunning that this passage, if this is written to a community, and it's intended, it's so easy for us to read. When we see you, we immediately think of ourselves. God is speaking through this scripture directly to me, and not realizing that in many cases in the Gospels, and particularly in Paul's letters, that the you is almost always to a group, plural. And so it took me to a place of, if Jesus says, if you all love me, you all will keep my commandments, and that he will, I will give you all another advocate. That word paraclete, which translates, as I understand it, one who goes along beside, is a good analogy for that. And so in these hard things that God calls us into as preachers, in particular, when we are preaching the truth, that, the church is given the spirit of truth. And so when we preach that truth, sometimes it is hard to hear. And for me in particular, I record our worship service. In fact, I got finished about 1:00 this morning because I had a really struggle getting my sermon done. So I was burning the early morning oil recording my sermon. But part of my struggle was how to address, for me, it's this issue of Ahmaud Arbery's murder, and so many people which I appreciate the social messaging on, run with Ahmaud, and run the 2.23 miles, all those things. And but how do you move the church to action? And those commandments, just as Nick pointed out, just a few minutes. If you were just kind of doing this conversation in real time, a few minutes before, you would have watched Jesus get up off the floor, something that a rabbi would never have done, to wash the feet of his disciples, and then say, "This is what you are supposed to do." The "you" being the plural, you. And so that's kind of where I am hearing this John passage take me, and where it did take me for my sermon.
And those are both beautiful commentaries on like the use of the commandment to love. I deal mostly with young adults, working at Vanderbilt in housing. I still talk to students regularly, check in during the school year. I'm definitely working with students, religious and non-religious, kind of working through what it means to be part of a new community here at Vanderbilt, as well as smaller communities, whether it be racial or religious or academic, and then the communities they left from their hometowns. And one of the things that's really hard is determining what your community is and what it means for all of us, the y'all. Some of them coming from up north, down south, you got to get saying the word y'all and hearing that. And I love what you said about it, not just being the personal you, because then we can really think about, well, what's best for my family, what's best for my household, but then the idea of what's best for everyone I may come in contact with. And I think that's where COVID has really had us struggling, because our contacts look very different.
Yeah.
And so you have to think not just the people I'm contacting in my house, but what happens when I go to church physically. I'm contacting a lot of different people who are a different community. Or now when I go to the grocery store, that's a different type of contact in a different community, because everyone who's in that grocery store at the same time you're there now becomes a smaller microcosm of community. And it's something we really need to think about as our state opens back up, as people start going to the barbershop or the gyms and trying to do a number of things. We really want to make sure that people are thinking about, like, it's not just me and my immediate family, but how I'm being loving towards the workers in retail, so that I'm not upset when they're asking for me to do something to help protect everyone there. And also we got to talk about what love looks like, because for some people, love is very different. In the Arbery case, I imagine that the McMichaels thought they were being loving towards their community by trying to protect them from a potential robber, because community looked different for them. Community looked like the people who live next door to them.
Mm-hmm.
But think about the humanity and the community of this person who was just running, who was trying to, live his life, get out and, stay fit, and didn't see him as part of the community. And I think that is something that Jesus also calls, like, who is your neighbor is another story we talk about. So in that instance, Ahmaud was not his neighbor, was not his part of his community. And he felt like he was doing something good for his community. And Glenn County Police believed so as well, and let him go and said there was no probable cause. And so even looking at the prisons, we think of people in prison as not part of our community. So therefore their rates of COVID doesn't affect us, because they're out of the community. They're their own little microcosm. So are we being loving towards them by keeping them on the outside, by keeping them as a separate statistic that doesn't really impact what is really Tennessee?
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to just add something I feel gets lost sometimes in the Arbery story, and in every kind of story going back to when we first started noticing these, and they started triggering national responses. This idea that the people who did it were acting out of, I want to choose my words carefully, solely out of a malicious hatred of this man running the street. Like, as you pointed out, they may have understood themselves as protecting something. And the question is not if we just demonize them, and we don't demonize the social forces that condition them to see him as a threat, to see him as something that they should be afraid of, we miss the point, because then we're demonizing individual people when we need to be talking about the evils that a whole way of thinking about people that's infected our whole society. And it's hard, because on the one hand, like, these are men who did, a violent act, who ended the life of another human being, simply because he was a black man jogging in a white neighborhood. And also, how do we reckon with the fact that they may well have been acting on a fear? It's not a just fear, it's not a moral fear, but they felt it. And it's like the question is not presuming that they're acting out of some malicious evil, but that they were acting out of something that they felt. And the problem is not that the problem is all these things, but it's also that they felt that fear.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's really interesting. I'm sure that I'm the only preacher who has preached something, and then right in the middle of the sentence, you've just stomped all over your own toes. And our bishop of the ELCA Southeastern Synod, which is Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, put out a pastoral message about Ahmaud. And one of the things that he said was that every face you look into, you see the face of God. And I immediately thought, the McMichaels, I am supposed to see the face of God in them. And Lauren, you brought that up as, what was their motivation, that they may have seen it as a loving, life-giving action to their community to protect their community. And then Joe, I think you really topped it off in terms of, that's the question we have to ask. And I think the system that we have to work on as preachers, preaching the truth, is exactly that. Why does the system not convict, emotionally or spiritually, the people who see the other and think it's okay to do them harm, make them do without, make them less than? Hope that they get their own because I got my own, and it really is a system issue.
And that thing that speaks to the First Peter part, talking about people who do harm and doing good. And so when you think that you're doing good in the name of Christ, in the name of Christianity, you feel like you're being a martyr. And I think we can look at, some people look at the McDaniels as martyrs, because they may have been doing what they thought was the Christianly thing, which we can say also wasn't loving, but they're being persecuted for them doing good. So what happens to the people who are harmed because other people made those choices? So what happens to the family of Ahmaud? What happens to the family of Breonna, who, they didn't make a choice. They weren't doing good per se, they weren't going out and being persecuted for doing God's work. They're just living their lives. They're just sleeping. They're just, Breonna was an EMT. She was a essential worker who was, going to work in the hospitals with COVID-19 patients. And then her life is snuffed out because of the systematic saying, like, this is a drug dealer's house, even though it wasn't. And like, we're doing good, and while we're being persecuted for doing good to protect. And so I want to talk about that suffering that happens in First Peter, when you can't say that I'm suffering for Christ. I'm suffering because I'm simply being. And that goes back to the John. Then how do we love those people? And how do we react in love, that we support them and not just say, I'm going to pray for you, our thoughts? Like the Run with Ahmaud is wonderful to show solidarity, but how do we change the system so these victims don't keep happening?
Mm-hmm.
And that, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking that language of suffering that's in First Peter, I completely agree with what you're saying, Lauren. Like the Black community in America in the past few years has been highlighted so many times, and for good reasons, because we need to call out these killings and it's never okay to kill someone. The self-defense argument obviously gets thrown out as way too often. It's not a good justification. But how do you bear witness, especially as preachers, and lay and ordained? How do we bear witness to this kind of suffering and not let folks fall into the trappings of a martyrhood victim mentality? Like there is a right and a wrong, and as Matt noted, the Imago Dei is in the faces of all these people, but like these people should be alive. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And we're now being, again, baptized by the suffering of fellow children of God. How do we bear witness to that in a way that is that's out of truth, that's not scared, but also that's sensitive to the dynamics of all that's going on, and doing it well? Because I think I love, like you said, Lauren, the Run with Ahmaud. I think that's great, but like, now what is going to be the next question? And I ask that of myself as someone who has the privilege of asking now what, and I wonder what's next.
Mhm.
And that can be really hard in a preaching moment. Because like Matt said, you realize you step on your own toes, or you kind of just run yourself off a cliff and go, we got to have faith now, because I just realized God has not yet answered what we do.
And one thing that I'm eager to talk about, Nick, when we spoke offline, I know you mentioned this dynamic. Both of these stories that we're talking about today, both coronavirus with its reopening and the totals and what to do with that, and this ongoing, sadly, story about black disposability at the hands of the police. Those are highly polarized issues where response tracks very closely to partisan identity, even though we might wish that they didn't. In rural counties and suburban counties, I mean, we can get a polarized reaction to these stories. How would you go about talking about these things that happened with people in your communities that you serve? Maybe that's a hard question. I apologize for putting you on the spot. Matt, if you want to help him out, that'd be great too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the old guy closest to retirement, and if I get run out of town, I can, start drawing my pension. And I only have to joke about that because there are risks to speaking the truth to power, and one of those risks as a person in a church who we make our living based on people giving offerings. And my favorite theologian, Reverend Dr. Anna Madsen, she got her doctorate in Germany, in Regensburg, and she talks about the German ecclesial system where people pay a tax. And so the pastor is not worried about what she or he preaches because they're not paid by the offerings of the people. Offerings of the people go to feeding programs and those kind of things, but the state literally pays their salaries. And we're not like that in America. We're more of a consumer-driven entity, and so what we say matters in terms of our livelihood. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Cost of Discipleship, where he says Christ bids a man come and die, and I think we don't push against that reality that as Christians, as followers of Christ, who calls us to love one another. And you look at who was in that room that Christ said, love one another, the one that was going to betray him, the one that's going to deny him, all of them who would abandon him. And he washed every one of their feet and then tells them, basically they had to know themselves and know that he had just washed their feet and they were not all in. And is he asking me to do the same thing? To wash the people of feet that I know are not all in with me. And I'm not saying I have that down. I stress every time I have to preach on something hard like this. But I think we're called to discern how far should we go. And maybe that when we are uncomfortable, maybe that's just the edge of how far we should go.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, it's important to maintain that relationship, right? You don't want to preach it so hard that you no longer have pastoral, the ability to be pastoral with that person. And also, how do you speak Peter's truth? Yeah, Nick.
Well, Matt, that was great. Because I agree. I think that I'm not putting myself on the line here. I mean, Dixon County, yes, is 93% white, and and that's its own weird kind of thing. But also this community, they're dealing with their own stuff. So to really dig down to that, Vanderbilt Divinity School education that I got, that I hope I am now making them somewhat proud, is, you have to deeply contextualize. And right now, at least for my people, they care. I mean, they know right and wrong. And I've been here for 5 years, so I'm not putting myself at risk by taking a stand to say, hey, people shouldn't die. I've been doing that since day one, not nearly as well for back then as I do now, I think. But it's the idea that you have to slip in those truths, at least to remind folks, like, this is the Christian, ethic. This is our way of being. And, we believe that people are redeemable. We believe that people have value, both the good and the evil. Like, No one's stuck. Same point in time, systems are, sin-based, and that's a whole different thing. And that's where you can really get yourself in trouble if you don't nuance that well. But I think it's, for most preachers, it's a matter of relationship, just hammering day in, day out the ethic that we claim to have. And, if and when something like this happens close to home, if anyone does speak up and say, well, I think yada, yada, if it's against the Christian ethic, it's okay to ask. I saw the cat and that made me laugh. It's okay to ask, is that what Jesus would want us to say or do? And those simple questions based out of love for the relationship you have with someone. I'm not going to go to the city square and argue with folks. That's someone else's job. I'm going to be the minister here who's known for saying, what would Jesus do? What would he say? And what would God have us do? And that's where you start.
My cat was saying she agreed. She came in to say, you should get that point right there. I think what you're saying is really, really important about the systems being sin-based and that people are not beyond redemption. And so what does it mean to be redeemed? I think of, and this was a few weeks back, the teen in Georgia. Georgia's having an amazing COVID-19 right now, who did the racist TikTok video. And so she got suspended, her and her boyfriend were suspended from school, even though they weren't in school at the moment. Or I should say expelled. She was a senior, supposed to be graduating. And, she gets like, you're ruining my life. And then there was a lot of conversations about like, this is a one-time thing. Why is this person being, persecuted? But then you ask the question, but what do y'all say about, again, going back to our prison population, people who are incarcerated? Maybe people, it's a one-time thing. Like you say, people don't deserve to die. Whether Ahmaud was, even if he was, which I don't think this is the case, he was the person stealing things in the neighborhood, the burglar. You don't die from burglarizing people. Even if Breonna's house was a trap house or where a criminal may have been living or someone who was, supposed to be taken into custody, she doesn't get to die because of association. And I think that is something we need to press and push other Christians on. If you're a Christian, you believe in redemption. You believe that, Jesus came and then it says it again here with Paul, that he died for our sins and that we are redeemed here. And so death doesn't mean because you did one little wrong thing that you deserve to die at the hands of the state or at the hand of someone who thinks they're acting on behalf of the state. And we have to really push that narrative so that the empathy comes through.
So when can you guest preach for me? I got a couple of Sundays open. That was excellent. I felt that.
One thing that I'm chewing on right now, especially in response to what you had said earlier, Nick, and I hope this speaks to what you said, Lauren, is one of the lessons that I learned as a chaplain student during my CPE unit is this: the supervisor would always tell us, if you're going to posit something, if you're going to say something, you have to get it back to the person you're saying to and let it sit in their lap and say, well, what do you think about this? Because they have to do their own work. I think the danger is one, under personalizing things. I think you and I talked yesterday, Nick, about, if we personalize these things and we make that about a person, that can be kind of an entry point into, an individual is relatable. A system is not relatable. But then we can sit back with them, like you said, and say, well, what do you do with this? What do you think you ought to do with this? And then we can give them all the things that Lauren just said and say, well, what do you do with this? How does this affect you personally? And how does this affect our congregation? And, I think we would all love to have our answers, but I think probably the pastoral work is to give the questions and try to support them in coming up with their own answers, because there'll be better answers that way that they can actually act on and own.
Yeah, not get like I was doing some advocacy for Insure Tennessee back several years ago, and I was in a legislator's office, and one of his staffers started accosting me pretty much. They came from the other end of the Christian doctrinal spectrum than us Lutherans. And one of my Methodist sister colleagues was in there with me, thank heavens. And the guy pushed a button to the point with me that I said, I don't care what God says. Because he used one of those proof text passages that you hardly can't say anything about. And so with our congregations and as preachers, absolutely, we have to be relational. We have to and tell them the truth at the same time. We do. I think that's to convince them that they are the owner of that as well. It's not just the preacher, it's the congregation. This John passage is about this gift of the Spirit. The promise of the Spirit is to this community. And what are we going to do with this Spirit of truth?
Amen. Does anyone have anything else to add on either we've been kind of bouncing between the Peter and the John. I want to make sure that we get to the Acts and the Psalm before we close for the day. But want to leave it up. Don't want to move things around too fast.
I do have one last point, kind of with the First Peter. It's also talking about what does a new normal look like as we get ready to open back up, as people are looking about, especially in Vanderbilt's context, students coming back to campus in the fall. I'm talking to a lot of students who are ready to get away from home, come back. They want to be among their peers. They want things to go back to normal. And I think we hear that a lot with the protests that were happening. They can't have a shut-in, like the economy needs to go back to normal. We need to also recognize there is a new normal.
Exactly.
Like we cannot go back to how we were before, just like after the tornadoes in March. We cannot go back to what East Nashville, what North Nashville looked like before those tornadoes hit. Even if we rebuild, they're not exactly the same. We cannot go back to our normal from after dealing with COVID. And we know we're going to be dealing with COVID for the next couple of years. Like, this is not something that's just going to evaporate and disappear. We're going to have to think about what our normal everyday lives look like. And if we're going to do this for the good of other people, and again, John, the love, it always comes back to love, right? Because Jesus always comes back to love. What are we doing in our new normal that shows love and consideration and care for other people outside of just ourselves and our immediate families? How do we show that we're going to be caring and good Christians who keeps Jesus' commandments in this new post-COVID, well, through COVID, because there's no post-COVID right now, lifeline starting today, yesterday, now that, there are certain businesses. If you go to a restaurant that's at half capacity, are you upset that you can't get in? Or are you making sure that you're taking precautions so that the people who may be 6 feet away from you aren't worried about your coughing?
Mm-hmm.
Being kind to those essential workers, to those waitresses and those waiters and the people serving your food? Are you tipping better? Because they've been furloughed probably and coming back and have bills they have to pay. Are we trying to be kind and thinking about other people's suffering as they try to do the good works that they're called to do?
That's a powerful point. I don't know if this is a good response, but just kind of transition us from the Peter to the Psalm, in 13 and 14 of that Peter reading we've got. Who will harm you if you're eager to do what is good? If we're eager to support our fellow workers, we're eager to support people who are on those front lines. There's still plenty of harm that can come to us, which is the sad irony of, even if you suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. I think there's sometimes a problematic thread that suffering is somehow a magic transaction that leads to blessedness, or that suffering is somehow something we should aspire to. It feels clear to me in this moment that suffering is not good. Right? Good things can come from suffering, just like, our redemption in Christ is born out of Christ's suffering on the cross. But that doesn't mean that the suffering itself is good. And it, a similar kind of theological, feels like a pitfall at the end of that Psalm, Psalm 66. I cried aloud to him, and he was extolled with my tongue. If I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But truly, God has listened. He has given heed to the words of my prayer. Blessed be God, because he has not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. I wonder about how do we talk about this kind of steadfast love or this hearing of prayer in the context of, I suspect there are many people whose prayers are going without the response that they desired at this moment in time, right? And that does this then mean that we cherish iniquity in our heart? And, being a good Calvinist, I would argue that everyone cherishes iniquity in their heart. But so what, right? If everyone is bad and Christ is, that salvation is offered to us, like how do we make sense of the fact that the suffering continues? And if Fauci and others are right, suffering will continue, and prayers, aren't being answered in the way that people would want them to. How do we talk about that pastorally in this moment?
And I'm going to have to agree with you a lot on that, Joe, because I'm a good Southern Baptist, born in Black Baptist churches. And I really struggle with this psalm because of the suffering narrative. And like, if he cherished my iniquity, if I had any iniquity in my heart, that he would not have heard me. Those kind of things just visually like, ooh, how are you pure? But from my Baptist background, I always go back to, getting through. So like in Psalm 66:12, well, actually, let's start with 66:11. You brought us into the net. Well, actually, start back to 10. Excuse me. Keep going backwards. For you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. You brought us into the net. You laid burdens on our backs. You let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, yet you have brought us out to a spacious place. Those 3 verses are the redemption verses for me in this particular psalm, because I am not part of the theology that everything bad comes from the devil. The theology, I think, is just bad in general, that we only attribute God to the good things and the devil for the bad things, that God can try us, that God can put us through something like the baptism that Nick was talking about, like COVID-19, to make us better, for us to see where our cracks are as a personal person, as a y'all community, and as like a general nation and global community. So we can see our cracks. So we can see that even in America, we are a third world country. We're in a Gucci belt, as I've seen in a couple of tweets, that there are some things in our systems that does not put us in first world territory. But then at the end of all of it, we are brought to a spacious place, that there is some redemption at the end of us going through this trial by fire, through this baptism of just awfulness for the past couple of months. So there's tornadoes on top of COVID, on top of unemployment, on top of economy, on top of people dying at the hands of the state, that there is a promised land at the end of it. And I don't mean heaven. I mean that we can actually look at our failings and come together and do better and be a better nation.
So as a Methodist, I'm like, yeah, that's Wesley's doctrine of sanctification and perfection. Because I'm not a Calvinist. Sometimes I lean that way, but you know what? It's fine. Southern is my theology more so than everything else. And it's always a matter of, consequences, whether or not it was brought on you by God, the devil, or in my language, typically in pastoral moments, is sheer chaos. God did not create the world out of nothing. God ordered chaos. So chaos is still out there causing crap, like floods, like tornadoes. And granted, we are adding to that. There's not to say that's not part of it. But I love the progression of the psalm. It starts off with, the normal opening, but then it's like, I've been through some stuff. Then I went and praised you nonetheless. I still went in your house. I still offered my offerings. I'm still sticking with my promise that I made to you, O God. And at the end, it says, and you hear me. So the psalm definitely has those vestiges of, bad things happen, and I don't know why, but it ends on this note of, but I have to believe in the end you were with me. Mm-hmm. And like you said, Lauren, like, we're going to get there some way, somehow. And here, we just don't know what that is yet.
And my here you go, my Lutheran theology, as where Luther says we are 100% sinner and 100% saint, both at the same time. And I couldn't help it. This is just my devious sense of humor. But verse 18, if I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But since I just let iniquity just sort of hang around, the Lord listened to me. So there may be that. We don't know for sure what the psalmist was getting at. But I totally go to the resolution here is that last verse, because he has not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. And I think that to me is always when there's the question of, good and evil, and is this because of God or is this because of some stupid thing I have done that I'm going through this horrible circumstance? That Jesus promises, I will never leave you or forsake you. And the Paraclete, the promise of the Spirit, that when you get to the Acts passage, to me, again, it's in that last sentence where it says he proved this by the resurrection. All this stuff that Jesus was proven, not by his death, but by the resurrection. And so I think just that these promises that we have of God's continual presence with us is what helps anchor us in these times of people in Middle Tennessee who are living with COVID when they were not even ready to start dealing with tornadoes. And who knows what'll be next. Well, the economy is something that we're dealing with too.
I appreciate the transition to Acts. I mean, we've got this early evangelical kind of movement of the early church where they're going to the Areopagus and just drawing a contrast between a God who exists in gold or silver or stone, who's an object for worship, with the God who made the world and everything. And as you said, the God who overlooks the time of human ignorance, commands everyone to repent because it fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. That this is a God who doesn't work by the rules we expect gods to work by, who works by God's own rules. And that rule is mercy and grace and appointing and affording righteousness to all, and giving us the assurance of Christ's resurrection.
Well, Joe, can I get a little political here? Am I allowed to be political on this?
Of course.
Let's talk about the economy. Talking about a God of gold and silver, a God that is based out of coins and stock markets and goods and services, and not having a safety net to help people to flow when the economy is stopped. I look at this passage and I feel just rebuke from Paul around folk who are willing to sacrifice lives for the economy. Is your God economy? Is your God people? Is your God nature that is doing better now that we've all had to, stay home, not drive everywhere? We've seen, there's been pictures of like really busy cities that actually have blue skies now. You can see life starting to recreate, but we want to sacrifice that because people want to buy things, because people want to make money, because people don't want to let people stay in their housing for longer because rent or mortgage is not paid. When the economy is something we made up, when the stock market is invisible goods, where money is only the value we assign it. And so we're assigning that value means more than people, which has been consistent with this country, unfortunately, where people are worth less than actual hard timber and money and gold. The gold standard are just paper bills. And I think we have to really talk about how we've made that a God here, that we're talking about we're a Christian nation. Well, is our nation of people or we're a nation of economy? When folk are like, I'll willingly sacrifice my grandmother, but would you really sacrifice yourself? Do you want to go back into your business to make money knowing that you will die? Mm-hmm. If you knew that you were going into the meat grinder in order for something else to produce, would you do it? And as you mentioned before when we got started, employees here in Tennessee who are now able to go back to work, no longer getting unemployment, and you can literally rat out your employees. Again, is a dollar more important than your own people? And have you made that into your God? And you have to, as Christians, we have to call that out. I get it. We need money to live. You have to pay rent or a mortgage or buy groceries. But what does it look? We had an opportunity during this crisis to say, what does it look like that debts are not important? That I will get food to people, that farmers don't have to sell their food or destroy crops because people aren't buying them right now, but they're able just to freely give to communities that don't have it. I was looking at, during this time, I have been doing retail therapy. I'm not going to lie, because being stuck in the house is a lot. But I've been trying to buy from like small local businesses. And I looked into a lot of local farms. And when I say local, I mean just Southern, some in Tennessee, some in Georgia. And I found some really just encouraging stories of like smaller farms that, because they can't have the open air markets they normally sell at, they are just donating their food to food banks. That's what I want to see out of our people, not the idea that our meat packing plants have to let 100 employees die because there might be a meat shortage. That's not what I'm looking for, and not what I'm seeing as someone who is a follower of God, a follower of Christ, doing in this type of situation.
And I think, it's interesting, the Acts passage, when the what was the second Sunday of Easter, when the second chapter of Acts comes up, where they sold their possessions so that no one was in need. And I've never really noticed this before. It didn't say they sold everything. It said they sold their possessions so no one would be in need, almost as if it was a stewarding of, if I have 8 cows, I don't slaughter all the cows. I keep a bull and a cow so I can have more cows later. But I'm okay with trusting that God will provide if I share my abundance with others. And I think this is exactly what Lauren's talking about in a country where we call ourselves a Christian nation. And when you think about this, I don't get why people who call us a Christian nation can't go on with, and so being Christian means loving your neighbor, making sure everybody has what they need, proclaiming the release of the captives and healing the sick. I mean, all those things that are supposed to be Christian values that somehow just never get looked at. It's just the 10 Commandments, which I think is Old Testament. Jesus knew about the 10 Commandments, but
it certainly is disappointing that, to jump back to the John and tie that into where we're at, that the spirit of truth, which the world cannot receive, that it is not being received. As John said, it wouldn't be. But in this time of not quite lockdown, but shelter at home orders, we haven't managed to develop new ways to solve that problem of the people need to eat, need to have a place to live, need to have health care. We just kind of put the whole system on pause and didn't spend any time thinking about how to change
we are
that.
literally.
Matt, I didn't hear what you said there.
We have a fire hydrant of money going on to the problem. I was thinking last night, I would be real curious what we would have spent if we'd 5 years ago had planned financially, economically, for what if this happens. If we'd bought tests and chemicals, and you think about the money we were spending to fix this problem, that because we were too afraid to spend money to prepare, and we didn't do it. And to me, that's part of what's mine is mine, and you can't have it unless there's an emergency type thing that I think Christians really should speak against.
Yeah, why didn't we have swabs?
Yeah,
a swab is not a complicated thing to manufacture. Right. It seems like. That's great. Any closing thoughts, or maybe if the two of you want to give us a preview on what you're thinking for this Sunday, that could be good.
Well, mine's done in the can, so
yeah,
recorded too, and I pretty much shared where I was going with it.
Very cool. That's right.
And for me, it's going to be, leaning into the whole, you know what to do. And if you need help doing it, God's there to help you do it, but you know what to do.
Mhm.
So the hard part is it's just one step in front of the other to love thy neighbor. And if we do that well, we can draw that circle real wide. So that's what I hope Christians in America, in the South, and in Middle Tennessee, and wherever all of our viewers are from, I hope that's what they'll do.
And then, Lauren, do you have any final thoughts for us? We are gonna take some questions from the attendees. We see we've got 4 folks listening in. If you've got a question while Lauren is talking, go ahead and click the raise hand button, and we'll be able to pipe you in for a quick question before we part. Lauren?
I just think that there is hope in us being able to be better every day, getting better every day, that God is expecting us to be better and more Christ-like. That's all the reason we're called Christians, is to become more Christ-like. And I kid with some people. I say, like, I'm not dying for you. I'm not Jesus. I don't want to go on that cross, but I am willing to be a disciple and do the work and get my feet dirty and get them wet and, really push everyone around me to be better as well. And so I think that on our 4 passages is about how do we do better and how do we instill hope, even at really, really difficult times, really difficult times.
Amen. I'm not seeing any questions from the audience. So with that, I think I'm going to bring us to a close. I think it's clear that the Spirit of the Lord was in this digital place with us all this afternoon. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks for doing it, Joe.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me, Joe.